She walked into that wedding believing love was the most powerful thing in a room. By the end of the night, she would learn something better, that the woman everyone underestimated is almost always the most dangerous person present. Melissa Raymond didn't realize it yet, but she was about to. If stories about betrayal, revenge, and powerful women rising from humiliation speak to you, make sure you subscribe right now. Because the people who skip subscribing often come back later saying, "I knew something terrible was about to happen. Why didn't I stay?" And if you think Melissa should walk out of that ballroom immediately, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. The chandeliers shouldn't have felt so cold. But standing in the center of the Old Man Grand ballroom, still wearing her wedding gown, Melissa Raymond felt every crystal above her blazing like an accusation. And she had arrived early to the reception. She had checked the flowers, approved the seating arrangements, smiled at every noble who passed, and rehearsed, for the 100th time, the quiet pride she planned to carry into this night. She was a duchess now. She had earned this. Then the whispers started. Not the warm kind that circle a bride. The kind that move like smoke, low, quick, and impossible to catch, before they've already filled the room. "Did you see the carriage?" "The east gate. It's just now." "He wasn't alone." Melissa didn't move. She stood exactly where Jeff had left her 40 minutes ago, after squeezing her hand, leaning close to her ear, and saying, "I'll be right back," in that voice she had trusted for 5 years. She waited for someone to correct the rumor. No one did. Instead, a woman near the pillar, Lady Arnett, who had always smiled too slowly, turned and looked at Melissa the way you look at someone who doesn't yet know their house is burning. And that was when a servant came through the side entrance. Young, pale. He crossed the ballroom without being called, stopped 2 feet from Melissa, and said nothing. He simply held out a folded cloth, the corner of a pocket square she had embroidered herself for Jeff that morning, left behind on the carriage seat. Melissa felt her chest tighten, not with grief, not yet. Something sharper, cleaner. She had spent 5 years defending this man, sat across from hostile nobles and smiled. He'd spent long nights reworking alliances after his father's scandal nearly destroyed the family name. She had loved him carefully, completely, and without asking for an audience. And now the audience had found her anyway. She looked up at the ballroom, at the staring faces, the frozen musicians, the fans that had stopped moving, and she understood something with sudden, brutal clarity. Everyone was waiting to see what the abandoned bride would do. Some were hoping she would cry. She didn't. That Melissa Raymond lifted her chin, pressed her hands flat against her chest, steady, deliberate, and walked to the center of the room. Her voice, when it came, did not shake. "The celebration will continue." The room went still. House Oldman does not falter. Not tonight. A murmur moved through the crowd, part admiration, part disbelief, part something no one had a name for yet. But even as she spoke, Melissa's mind was already moving somewhere else entirely. Because one name had cut through every whisper she'd caught tonight. Victoria Hallberg, elegant, dangerous, connected to the very scandal Melissa had spent years quietly helping Jeff bury. The same woman who had been sending letters to the palace for weeks. Letters Jeff had never mentioned. Melissa had assumed it was politics. Now she wasn't sure what it was, but she intended to find out. But what the royal court didn't know, what even Jeff didn't know, was that the woman standing abandoned in the center of that ballroom was not simply a loyal bride. She was her father's daughter, and her father had once been the most quietly powerful man in the kingdom. If you came here for a story about a woman who stays broken, this isn't that story. Subscribe now, because what Melissa does next is the part no one saw coming. And drop a comment. Would you have stayed in that ballroom, and or walked straight out the palace gates? But to understand what Melissa did next, You need to understand who she was before she ever set foot in that ballroom. 5 years earlier, House Oldman was one scandal away from collapse. Duke Jeff Oldman was a man drowning in his father's disgrace, and Melissa Raymond was the woman who chose, quietly and without recognition, to throw him a rope. This is where the real story begins. The first thing Melissa heard was Lady Arnett's fan snapping shut, as then the murmuring started. Low at first, moving through the ballroom in careful waves, noble to noble, ear to ear, the kind of whispers that were never meant to be private. 3 years of rebuilding his family name, and he walks out on the same night. Did anyone really expect this to last? She didn't turn toward the voices. She had learned, early in her years at court, that turning toward cruelty only invited more of it. But then came the one she couldn't ignore. The Lord Crestwall, a man who had accepted wine from her table not 2 hours ago, leaned toward the woman beside him and said, loudly enough to be heard across half the room, "I suppose House Oldman finally came to its senses. You cannot polish a name like Raymond into something it was never meant to be." Soft laughter followed, carefully muffled, deliberately audible. Melissa's jaw tightened, just once. Then she released it. A hand touched her elbow. Her lady's maid, Senna, appearing from nowhere the way she always did in difficult moments. Senna leaned close, her voice barely a breath. "Lady Prewitt is saying he left with Victoria Halberg." The name landed like a stone dropping into still water. Victoria Halberg. Melissa knew the name the way every careful person at court knew it, not from introductions, but from the silences that followed it. Victoria controlled half the kingdom's financial networks, or so the rumors said. Yeah, she didn't attend events to be seen. She attended them to collect what she needed and disappear before anyone thought to ask questions. The musicians, after an agonizing silence, began playing again. A waltz. Stiff and uncertain, as though even they weren't sure the night deserved music anymore. Around Melissa, guests waited. She could feel it, that particular tension of a crowd that has gathered to witness a collapse. Faces politely averted but eyes tracking every movement. Glasses raised but not drunk from. A room holding its breath. They wanted her to break, some out of pity, some out of something far less kind. Melissa took one slow breath. Then she walked. Not toward the exit. Not toward the shadows at the edge of the room where she could have quietly disappeared, and no one would have blamed her. She walked to the head of the ballroom. The musicians faltered and stopped. Every face in the room turned toward her, and Melissa stood beneath the grandest chandelier in the Oldman estate. Her wedding gown still immaculate, her hands folded in front of her, her spine straight. And she looked out at the assembled nobility of the royal court as though she had called this meeting herself. "The celebration will continue." Her voice was even, final. "House Oldman does not falter, not tonight, not in front of anyone." Silence. Then, slowly, the orchestra began again. Guests exchanged glances, uncertain. They startled, recalibrating. One by one they turned back to their conversations, their wine, their carefully neutral expressions. Lord Crestwall said nothing more. Senna reappeared at Melissa's side a moment later, pressing a glass into her hand. "Well done," she whispered. Melissa didn't respond, because what no one in that ballroom could see, what she had no intention of showing them, was what was quietly building beneath the composure. Not grief, not humiliation, something far more useful. She thought of the name again. Victoria Halberg, and she began to think carefully. Melissa didn't sleep. She sat at the writing desk in her chambers, still in her wedding gown, because changing felt like an admission of something she wasn't ready to admit. And she thought. Not about Jeff's absence. Not about the ballroom or Lord Crestwall's voice or the way the musicians had faltered mid-waltz. She thought about Victoria Hallberg. At first light, she called for Senna. Her maid arrived quickly, which told Melissa she hadn't slept either. Senna had served the Raymond household since before Melissa could read. She was not a woman who offered comfort easily, which was precisely why Melissa trusted her. "The letters," Melissa said. "The ones that came for Jeff before the wedding. How many?" Senna didn't hesitate. 7, perhaps 8. The last one arrived 4 days ago. You saw the handwriting?" A pause, careful, waited. "Once, and when a footman left one unattended." "And?" Senna folded her hands. It was a woman's hand. Formal, controlled. The kind of script they teach girls who grow up knowing their letters will be read by powerful people. Melissa absorbed this quietly. Victoria Hallberg. Senna said nothing, which was answer enough. Melissa rose from the desk and moved to the window. The estate grounds below were still. Morning fog sitting low over the stone paths, the gates closed, so the night's shame already being swept quietly under the palace's polished floors. She had heard the rumors about Victoria Hallberg the same way you hear rumors about weather, distantly, until it arrives at your door. 3 noble houses had collapsed in the past decade after crossing her, not violently, methodically, the right whisper in the right ear at the right moment. A financial record surfacing unexpectedly, a letter appearing that was never meant to be read. And powerful men who had laughed at Victoria's name in private had found within a year that they had nothing left to laugh about. She didn't destroy people loudly. She simply ensured they destroyed themselves. Melissa pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass of the window, and then she remembered something. 8 months ago. A quiet dinner, just the 2 of them, after a particularly brutal session of council politics. Now, Jeff had been tired in the specific way he got when something was weighing on him beneath the surface. He had poured his wine, looked out the window for a long moment, and said, almost to himself, "Some enemies cannot be fought openly, Melissa. The ones who understand that are the ones who survive." She had thought nothing of it then. Jeff spoke in political abstractions when he was tired. It was a habit she had long since stopped questioning. She was questioning it now, because the more she turned the pieces over, the secret letters, the weeks of silence, the precise timing of his disappearance, the look in his eyes at the altar that she had told herself was nerves, the less it felt like betrayal, and the more it felt like something else entirely. Planned. Not by a man abandoning his wife, by a man who believed he was out of options. Melissa stepped back from the window. The fog outside was beginning to thin, and she needed to know what Victoria Hallberg had on Jeff. She needed to know how long it had been happening, and what had been promised, and what was at stake. She needed, above all, to understand the full shape of the trap before she decided how to dismantle it. Before we go further, I have to ask you something. If your husband left your wedding reception with another woman, would you forgive him, expose him, or destroy him? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you're still here without subscribing, the twist coming in the next chapter is exactly the kind that makes people say they wished they'd stayed from the beginning. Jeff's private study smelled like cedar wood and old paper. Melissa had been inside it only a handful of times. Always invited, always accompanied. It was one of those rooms that communicated, without saying so directly, that it belonged to someone else. She entered alone. She told herself she was looking for answers, and what she was really looking for was a reason to believe that the man she married was still worth understanding. The desk was orderly in the way that suggested recent tidying, the kind done quickly before a long absence. She moved through the surface drawers first. Correspondence, council minutes, property records. Nothing that couldn't be explained. Then she tried the lower left drawer. Locked. Melissa looked at it for a moment. Then she crossed to the fireplace mantel. They ran her fingers along the underside of the carved edging, and found the key exactly where her father had once told her men like Jeff always kept spare keys, close enough to feel secure, hidden just carelessly enough to be found. The drawer opened. Inside was a leather folio, unmarked, thick with age. She carried it to the desk and opened it carefully. The documents inside were dated 11 years earlier, from the period Melissa knew only in broad strokes as the Oldman scandal. Jeff's father, Duke Harlan Oldman, had been accused of passing military intelligence to a rival faction within the Royal Council. The accusation had never been formally prosecuted, but it hadn't needed to be. The rumor alone had been enough to fracture the family's alliances, freeze their assets for 2 years, and, by most quiet accounts, drive Harlan Oldman to an early grave. Melissa read slowly. Then she read again. The accusation rested on 3 documents, intercepted letters, allegedly in Harlan's hand, detailing troop movements and council votes. She was not an investigator, but she had spent years reading political correspondence, and something about the phrasing sat wrong. Too clean, too precisely damning. Real men, even guilty ones, did not write their crimes in tidy, complete sentences. She turned to the final page. A witness attestation, confirming the authenticity of the letters. Signed at the bottom in a controlled, formal hand, she now recognized. To Victoria Hallberg. Melissa set the page down. She sat with it for a long moment, the particular stillness of a mind rearranging everything it thought it knew. Victoria hadn't simply involved herself with House Oldman after the scandal. She had built the scandal. Harlan Oldman had spent the last years of his life trying to prove his innocence against evidence that had been designed to be unprovable. And when he died, quietly, but without vindication, his son had inherited not just a title and a damaged name, but an enemy who now held the proof of her own crime. Jeff didn't just have something to lose. He had been losing, slowly and deliberately, for 11 years, and Victoria Hallberg had been patient enough to wait until his wedding night to collect. The letter arrived on the 3rd morning, slipped beneath her chamber door before dawn. No seal, no formal heading, and just her name in Jeff's handwriting, the particular slant she had read across 100 notes over 5 years, and 4 words beneath it. The garden at Renfield. Melissa told no one. She dressed plainly, took a single outrider she trusted, and rode out before the household stirred. Renfield sat a half-hour outside the capital, a small private estate the Oldman family had used for quiet meetings since before Jeff's father, and the garden at its center was overgrown in the deliberate way wealthy people sometimes preferred. Rose bushes left to sprawl, gravel paths softened by moss, a place designed to feel forgotten. Jeff was already there when she arrived. She almost didn't recognize him. He was sitting on a low stone bench near the far wall, coat unbuttoned, no attendants, no political posture. The man she saw looked like someone who had not slept since the wedding, hollow around the eyes, his shoulders carrying a weight that formal clothing usually concealed. He stood when he heard her approach, and for a moment he simply looked at her with an expression she had no name for. Not guilt, exactly. Something beyond it. "You came," he said. "I came for answers," Melissa replied. "Not a reconciliation." He nodded, as though he had expected nothing more. Then he sat back down, and after a moment, she took the bench opposite. He told her everything. Now, Victoria had made contact 6 weeks before the wedding. The message was simple and precise. She possessed the original documents from his father's scandal, including the forged attestations, and she had copies placed with 3 separate parties, with instructions to release them publicly upon her word. Not just the original accusations, the proof that the Oldman name had been deliberately ruined, which meant the proof that Jeff had known about the fabrication and said nothing. Silence, as Victoria had explained, was its own form of guilt. She had demanded one thing, that Jeff leave the reception with her before midnight to begin formal negotiations. A transfer of financial holdings, a seat on a private council she controlled, ongoing compliance going forward. A leash fitted quietly, in full view of the royal court, while everyone assumed it was merely a scandal. If I refused, Jeff said, his voice flat, she would release everything by morning. My father's name destroyed permanently. The title challenged. The family removed from the council. So you left. I left. The garden was very quiet. You humiliated me in front of every noble in the kingdom, Melissa said, to buy yourself one night of negotiation with a woman who already owns you. Jeff said nothing. There was nothing to say. Did it work? She asked. No. His jaw tightened. She's not negotiating. She never intended to. She wanted the public moment, and she wanted the court to see me walk out. That image is worth more to her than any document. Melissa looked at him steadily. Because it proves she can move you whenever she chooses. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Jeff, Victoria Hallberg isn't only doing this to you. He looked up. I've spent 3 days reading what I could find. Melissa kept her voice even. House Brennan, House Coulterley, Lord Ashwick's financial collapse 2 years ago. The Prewitt military inquiry. She watched his expression shift as the shape of it landed. She's running the same pattern across at least 6 noble families, Melissa said. You're not her target. You're one thread in something much larger. Jeff stared at her. And for the first time since the wedding night, Melissa felt the balance between them quietly, irrevocably shift. And Jeff was still processing what she'd told him about the other houses when Melissa reached into the fold of her riding coat and set a small leather journal on the bench between them. He looked at it, then at her. What is that? My father's, she said. Or rather, what he left me when he died. She had rehearsed in some private part of her mind how she might one day explain Edmund Raymond to someone who only knew him as a minor noble who had served the crown quietly and died without ceremony. She had never imagined the conversation would happen in an overgrown garden 3 days after her wedding. But then, she had not imagined most of this week. Most people knew my father as a diplomat, she said. A background figure, competent but unremarkable. She paused. That was intentional. For the last 11 years of his life, Edmund Raymond served as a private intelligence advisor to the Crown. Not officially. Nothing recorded in any council document. He built and maintained a network of informants, servants, clerks, minor officials, people no one at court thought to watch. Across 8 noble houses and 4 royal institutions. Jeff said nothing. She could see him recalibrating. When he died, he left me 2 things. The journal, which contains the names, positions, hours and contact protocols for everyone still active in the network, and a letter explaining that he had been watching Victoria Hallberg for the last 3 years of his life. The garden was very still. He knew, Jeff said quietly. He suspected. He didn't live long enough to finish. Melissa looked at the journal. I have. She had spent 3 years doing what her father had trained her, without ever stating it directly, to do. Reading correspondence between the lines, tracking patterns in political appointments, noting which scandals surfaced conveniently and which were buried without explanation. Building, slowly and without announcing it to anyone, a picture of how Victoria Hallberg operated. She has enemies, Melissa said. Real ones. Lord Fenwick on the Eastern Council has been quietly building a case against her financial practices for 2 years. He lacks the evidence to move publicly. Lady Corrin lost her brother to one of Victoria's manufactured scandals and has spent 4 years waiting for an opportunity. There are 3 others. They've done nothing, Jeff said, because they've each been working alone. Isolated. Victoria survives by ensuring no one who opposes her ever finds the others. Melissa finally looked up at him. "I know where they all are. I know what each of them has, and I know which piece of evidence, placed in front of which person, would be enough to make them move together." Jeff stared at her for a long moment. "You've had this entire time," he said slowly. "You could have used this before the wedding. You could have protected yourself." "I didn't know she was coming for you specifically," Melissa said. "Not until the night she took you out of that ballroom." A silence settled between them, heavier than anger, more complicated than forgiveness. "I can dismantle her," Melissa said. "But not alone. I need access to the council chamber, and I need someone Victoria already believes she controls." She held his gaze steadily. "I need you." Jeff looked at her. This woman he had left standing in a ballroom 3 days ago, whom the entire court had written off as a casualty, and said nothing for a long time. Then, "What do you need me to do?" Now pause for a moment. If you were Melissa, would you help the man who humiliated you on your wedding night? Or would you let him lose everything? Be honest in the comments, and if you're still here without subscribing, the final chapters change everything. Don't be the one who comes back wishing they hadn't missed it. They agreed on 3 rules before they parted ways at Renfield. No written communication, no visible change in behavior, and under no circumstances were they to appear reconciled. Not to servants, not to allies, not to anyone at court whose loyalty hadn't been verified twice over. To the kingdom, Duke Jeff Oldman had humiliated his bride and was now managing the quiet wreckage of a damaged marriage. That story needed to remain intact, because it was the most useful cover either of them had. Melissa returned to the Oldman estate and resumed her role without adjustment. She attended the Countess Breval's afternoon reception 4 days after Renfield, wearing a pale grey gown that read, to anyone paying attention, as dignified restraint. Several noble women approached her with the particular warmth reserved for women who had recently suffered publicly. She accepted their sympathy graciously. She asked careful questions in return. She remembered everything. She attended 2 council dinners, a charity presentation at the Royal Hall, and a small private gathering hosted by Lord Fenwick, the Eastern Council member her father's journal had flagged as Victoria's most motivated enemy. She said nothing of consequence to Fenwick directly, but she made sure, before the evening ended, that he had noticed her. That was enough for now. To the court, she was exactly what they expected. A composed woman navigating humiliation with admirable restraint. Occasionally a little quiet. Occasionally distant. Nobody looked twice, which meant nobody saw what she was collecting. Jeff, meanwhile, was doing his part. Victoria had requested 2 further meetings since the wedding night, and each conducted under the pretense of financial consultation. Jeff attended both. He was cooperative, slightly desperate, and carefully imprecise, feeding her information that was credible enough to trust and flawed enough to mislead. A timeline shifted by 2 weeks. A name slightly wrong. Errors that would only become visible once it was too late to correct them. It was delicate work. Victoria was not careless. She cross-referenced everything, and then Jeff had to ensure his inaccuracies landed in the gaps between what she could verify. Twice, Melissa received word through the network that Victoria had made inquiries about her specifically. Both times the inquiries were the same. Is she stable? Is she a problem? Both times the answer that came back was the same. She's grieving. No threat. Melissa read those reports and felt something close to satisfaction. There was a particular kind of invisibility that came with being underestimated. She had worn it before, in smaller ways. The diplomat's daughter at a noble table, the outsider who rebuilt a house that wasn't hers by birth. She knew how to make stillness look like surrender. Victoria Hallberg had spent years studying powerful men. She had not thought to study the abandoned bride standing quietly at the edge of the room. That was going to cost her everything. The Royal Winter Council met on the first Thursday of every month. It was the one gathering that required attendance from every titled house. No exceptions, no absences without formal cause. The king presided. The full chamber assembled. Whatever was said inside those walls carried the weight of the crown behind it. Melissa had chosen the date 3 weeks in advance. She arrived early, which no one found unusual. She took her seat in the gallery reserved for ducal spouses, to which no one found unusual either. She wore deep blue, composed, formal, unremarkable. She carried a leather satchel that several people noticed and no one thought to question. Jeff was already seated at the council table when she entered. He did not look at her. Victoria Hallberg sat 3 seats to his left in the chair allocated to her as financial advisor to the Eastern Council. She was, as always, immaculate. Dark gown, hair pinned with precision, an expression arranged into the particular neutrality of someone who had learned long ago that watchfulness was best disguised as calm. She glanced at Melissa once as the chamber filled. Then she looked away. The session opened with routine business, border agreements, trade levies, a minor dispute between 2 northern houses. Melissa listened without moving. Beside her, Senna sat with her hands folded, the only person in the room who knew exactly what was in the satchel. When the presiding chamberlain called for any matters of urgent noble concern, Melissa stood. The room noticed. A ducal spouse addressing the full council was unusual, not prohibited, but unusual enough that the murmuring began immediately. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying cleanly across the chamber, "I request permission to present documentation relevant to the security of multiple noble houses and the integrity of this council." The king studied her for a moment, and then he nodded. She opened the satchel. What followed took 11 minutes. She presented it in order, methodically, without theatre. The letters first. Correspondence between Victoria and 3 separate financial brokers, arranging the transfer of funds contingent on specific noble houses losing their council seats. Then the bribes. Payments made to clerks, record keepers, and 1 junior royal archivist in exchange for access to private family documents. Then the manufactured scandals, 6 of them, each supported by forged attestations, each timed to coincide with a moment of political vulnerability in the targeted house. The chamber had gone very quiet by the 4th document. Victoria did not move, but Melissa watched her hands, resting on the table, press flat in a way that had nothing to do with composure. "These are fabrications," Victoria said, when Melissa paused. Her voice was even, of the work of a bitter woman attempting to redirect blame for her husband's, "Your Majesty." Melissa set the final document on the table before the king. "This is the original attestation used to establish the treason charges against the late Duke Harlan Oldman 11 years ago. A handwriting analysis, conducted independently by 2 royal archivists, confirms the signature was added after the document was drafted, in a different ink, on a different day." She looked at the king directly. "The signature belongs to Lady Victoria Hallberg." The chamber erupted. Melissa stood still at the center of it. Voices colliding, chairs scraping, the chamberlain calling for order, and watched Victoria Hallberg's face do something she suspected very few people had ever seen it do. It broke, not dramatically. Just a single unguarded moment, a flicker of something exposed and desperate behind the careful eyes, before the composure tried to reassemble itself. It was too late. The king's guard was already moving. The court changed its story within a week. That was how Melissa had always understood power at this level. Not as something seized in a single moment, but as a narrative that the room quietly rewrote for itself once the outcome became undeniable. The same nobles who had watched her stand frozen in a wedding gown now spoke of her composure that night as though they had admired it all along. The whispers that had moved through the ballroom like poison now moved in the opposite direction, carrying a different kind of currency. She knew. From the very beginning, she knew. She hadn't entirely, but she saw no reason to correct them. Lord Fenwick requested a formal introduction 3 days after the council meeting. Lady Corrin sent flowers with a note that said only, "Your father would be proud." The 2 houses that had quietly avoided the old man estate since the wedding now sent representatives asking about the Duchess's availability for consultation. The abandoned bride had become something the court didn't quite have a word for yet. They were working on one. Jeff came to her study on a grey Tuesday morning, 11 days after Victoria Hallberg had been escorted from the council chamber. He knocked, which he had never done before. Melissa looked up from her correspondence. "Come in." He entered and stood near the door for a moment. Not the Duke the court saw, not the composed political figure. Just a man carrying something he had rehearsed and still wasn't sure how to deliver. She set down her pen and waited. "I need to say something," he said. "Not as an explanation. I'm not asking you to receive it as one." "Then say it." He looked at her steadily. "I never wanted to humiliate you. I want you to know that. Not as a defense. I understand what that night cost you, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I need you to know that when I left that ballroom, the only thing I believed I was doing was protecting what remained of this house." A pause. "I was wrong. About the method, about Victoria, about what I was capable of handling alone." The room was quiet. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping you out of it," he continued. "I told myself you were safer not knowing. The truth is—" He stopped and started again. "The truth is, I didn't believe you needed to be in the room where the real decisions were made, and that was the most significant miscalculation of my life." Melissa studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "Next time, Duke Oldman, trust your wife." Something moved across his face. Not quite relief, not quite absolution. Something quieter and more permanent than either. "Yes," he said simply. I intend to." The court never fully agreed on how to categorize what Melissa Raymond had done. Some called it loyalty. Some called it strategy. Some, in private, called it the most elegant act of controlled devastation the Royal Council had witnessed in a generation. What they agreed on, what became over the following months simply the accepted truth, was this. She had entered the Oldman estate as a bride. She had stood in the center of a ballroom in a white gown while the room waited for her to collapse. And she had left that council chamber as something the kingdom's most powerful woman had fatally underestimated. A duchess, her father's daughter, and the most dangerous person in the room. Not because she had sought power, but because she had understood, long before anyone thought to watch her, exactly how it worked. And Jeff Oldman had spent years looking for allies in council chambers and noble houses and carefully negotiated agreements. His greatest ally had been sitting across from him at dinner the entire time. It had simply taken losing her, briefly, for him to finally see it. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, more healing, and unforgettable twists.